All right, so there's discussion, like you can see already. We're going to look at these other parts of the nervous system. So last time we're looking at the cerebrum, which is the telencephalon. Now we're going to look at the diencephalon. Then we also look at the brain stem. Then we can now look at the cranial nerves, right? So looking at time, we'll see how far we can go with that. Then we can finish up with the remainder in the other discussions. So like you already know, saying the central nervous system usually begins just as a tube, all right? And that tube begins to develop around 4th week of gestation. That is the time, 4th week from fertilization. The nervous system begins to develop, all right? Now, around that region, the part of the tube that faces the future brain develops 3 vesicles. So we call those as primary brain vesicles, right? So this is a neural tube. So initially, what you're looking at here is an embryo, right? Then that is the amnion. Inside there will be amniotic fluid. Now, an embryo is composed of 3 layers: ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. Now, on the surface of the embryo, that's where the ectoderm is, because it is superficial. All right, so what we're looking at here is we're looking at the embryo from above. So this is a superior view of the embryo. Now, what happens initially, these layers, the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm, are flat. So you have an outer layer, the middle layer will be here. Oh, yeah, then the inner layer, the endoderm, will be deeper. So now what happens around the end of 3rd week and beginning of 4th week, what happens is the ectoderm begins to fold, right? And this is how it folds. So the edges tend to come towards the middle. You see, it was flat, now it is folding. So when it completely folds, it forms this structure now. This is a neural tube, all right? Now see that these cells here, or this part of the ectoderm was here. This part was there. What will follow next is as these parts will approximate each other, all right? So these cells that were here, there, now they are closer to each other. We call them as neural crest cells because that is a neural fold. This fold and that fold converge to give us a tube like this one, and there's a cavity inside there. That's a cavity there. This is what will form the cavity. At this stage, it's just a groove. All right. Now, cells here form the neural crest cells, and when we were discussing the endocrine system, we were saying neural crest cells migrate from the neural tube and enter other visceral organs. One of them was the adrenal gland or the suprarenal gland. We say the mid portion, the medulla of the adrenal gland, is formed by cells that migrate from this neural tube, what we call the neural crest cells. All right. So those are neural crest cells there. This is now the neural tube. Now, this tube will have 2 pores or 2 ends. So one part of the tube, the other end will be facing here, where the head will be. Then the other end will face where the coccyx will be. So we call this as a caudal end, and we'll call that as the cephalic end. So of the two, the cephalic end grows rapidly than the caudal end. And that's why the spinal cord is small as compared to the brain. So this is a future brain. Now, as it grows, we'll see that it will form vesicles, 3 swellings, all right? Now, before that, this tube must completely close. You see that there's a gap here, there's a gap there. So these gaps must close and then fuse at the far end then. Come in. What's up? No, just beg your pardon. Let me. Okay, sorry for that disturbance. So I was saying these must close. So this tube must be solid. Up there should be closed. Down here should be closed. Then this far end also should close. So that part should close. This part should close. Now, in an instance that any of these pores fail to close, that pore fails to close, even this one fails to close, then conditions known as neurotube defects arise. One of them is anencephaly. I think I have those images. All right, so we're saying by day 23, these must close. All right, so the caudal end, the caudal pore closes earlier than the cephalic end. So this is where the brain will be. This is where the coccyx will be. So by day 23, the caudal neuropore closes. Then 3 days later, the cephalic pore will also close. So this one and this one will fuse. That one and that one will fuse as well. Then we say now the neurotube is fully closed. And that way, it allows now normal and proper growth of the brain and the spinal cord. In an event that these two pores, maybe this one doesn't close or that one, or both of them don't close, that's when you develop or we find conditions like neurotube defect. Commonest among them are spina bifida of different types. There's spina bifida occulta, spina bifida with meningocele, and spina bifida with myelomeningocele, those 3 types. And their severity in the order that I have mentioned them. When the cephalic pore doesn't close, usually these are babies who are born with anencephaly, right? It's because this doesn't close. Now, what arises if there's failure of any of these is, we said this tube has fluid inside, right? There's fluid there. Okay, now this fluid is continuously mixing with the amniotic fluid. So amniotic fluid will enter from here and come out from the other side, or enter from here and come out from the other side. Now, if it doesn't close, then the cells that are supposed to give us parts of the brain are not staying there. They're being washed out. Same with this part. If this doesn't close, the cells that are supposed to completely close and form the caudal portion of the spinal cord are being washed out as the fluid is moving in and out of the neurotube. So at some point, fluid should stop entering this tube because these pores must close. Unless they fail, then such conditions arise. In a nutshell, that's what happens. Now, since we have mentioned that, we're saying when they close now, the cephalic end, this end, after closure, the cephalic end will give us 3 swellings that you can already see here. There's that one, and that one. So those swellings are given as prosencephalon. So the prosencephalon is the swelling that is most anterior, all right? Most in front. Okay. So the swelling that will be in front there, we'll call it the prosencephalon. And later on will give us the telencephalon and the diencephalon. Then the swelling that is in the mid portion, we are going to call it the mesencephalon, or what is referred to as a midbrain. Then the swelling that is posterior, we call it the rhombencephalon, or otherwise known as the hindbrain. So during development, the brain has 3 swellings: forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. Okay. So there will be forebrain in front there, midbrain, and hindbrain. The hindbrain is what will give us the pons and medulla oblongata. All right. Then the prosencephalon or the forebrain will give us the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The mesencephalon will just give us one structure, which is the midbrain. So midbrain remains midbrain, even in adult brain. But in adult brain, prosencephalon gives us 2 structures, the cerebrum and the diencephalon. Okay. Then the rhombencephalon will give us two structures, the pons, medulla, or oblongata. All right, so already we are already prompting the parts of the diencephalon. So we're saying diencephalon is part of the forebrain, like I've already explained, and it's now embedded in between the cerebrum. That's why it's hidden from view. You can't see it if you're holding the brain that is intact. You have to cut through the brain and study the middle part. That's where the diencephalon is found. Away from that, we say the diencephalon now will be found in between two structures. It will be found between the cerebrum and the midbrain, that part. Midbrain, above it is cerebrum. That is the diencephalon. Now, diencephalon has the following parts. Thalamus, which is the largest part of the diencephalon. Hypothalamus, the structure which we discussed under endocrine system. Epithalamus, okay? Epithalamus, we are now looking at the pineal gland. Then we have the subthalamus. We are now looking at the hypothalamus and its stalk. Not forgetting the mammillary bodies. So those are mammillary bodies. That is the pituitary gland. That's a pituitary stalk. Now, within the thalamus, because it looks roundish, inside there, that's where we have the third ventricle. So in short, the shell or the outer coverings of the third ventricle is actually the thalamus itself. So the thalamus is found inside there. So the thalamus forms the walls of the third ventricle. So inside there, this swelling, we're going to find cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. Then we know that within the telencephalon, of course, we have the first and second ventricles, or simply the lateral ventricles. So that is the diencephalon. What we are looking at is the thalamus. Then there is the third ventricle. So that's the third ventricle there. Right. This is a corpus callosum. This one here, corpus callosum, attaching left hemisphere of the brain to the right hemisphere. Diencephalon, mainly the thalamus. That's the thalamus there. This is the hypothalamus. You can see pituitary is cut off there, but that's a stalk. Okay, that's the hypothalamus. Then this is the epithalamus, or what you can call the pineal gland. Midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, and cerebellum. Okay, so this is an image of a real brain from the laboratory. Okay. All right, these are the structures. We'll discuss them more when we start talking about the ventricular system of the brain. So we'll talk about the ventricles in a separate discussion. For now, we're looking at midbrain. We're looking at diencephalon, midbrain, and the cranial nerves. So all these structures, we'll be able to discuss them under the ventricular system. I don't want to go into that because of time. All right. Now, we're saying the diencephalon is a gateway to the cerebral hemispheres. All right. So it's like the highway to the cerebral hemisphere. So any information that is coming from the spinal cord, that is coming from the brain stem, for it to reach the cerebrum, has to pass through the diencephalon. Right? After all, the diencephalon during development is part of the cerebrum. Right. So here we're saying almost all ascending sensory pathways must pass through the diencephalon. All right. So almost all ascending neurons, remember ascending neurons, all of them are sensory. They are taking sensation from different parts of the body for the brain to interpret. So they must pass through the diencephalon, mainly the thalamus. Look at that. That's the thalamus. Then from here, sensory nerves will go in different directions of the cerebrum or the telencephalon. That's why I always, equate this one to the network tower, where different signals towards different phones will pass through. So a signal go to the network tower, and then the tower will channel that signal to the appropriate phone number. That's what the thalamus does as well, taking information to the right part of the brain for interpretation. So what is a function? So each component of the diencephalon has a specialized function. Now, this part of the brain is integral, or is essential for life. All right, we need to know what is happening in the body, and we need to respond to that. Okay, but in all, the diencephalon simply acts as a relay and does some bit of processing, but mainly processing of information happens with the telencephalon or the cerebrum itself. So relay meaning just channeling, more like conduits. You know, you have those conduit pipes where electric cables will pass through. Okay, so it just relays information. It will not generate the information itself, but will just relay it, more like a booster pump, if you like, or a transformer. It's not generating power, but just boosting the power so that it reaches in the right voltage to various parts of, you know, the electric supply chain. Same with the diencephalon. Then what about connection? Which other parts of the brain are connected to the diencephalon? Number one is the limbic system. Now, we discussed a bit about the limbic system. So this is a system of survival. Okay, emotion, behavior, response to food, and reproduction. All those functions are associated with the limbic system. Number two is basal ganglia. In the preamble, when we're talking about introduction to the nervous system, I hinted on the basal ganglia to say there are certain groups of cell bodies found within the white matter, but they are located almost at the base of the brain, closer to the brain stem. Now, we can't call it cortex. Why? Because it is found within white matter. Under normal circumstances, cortex is supposed to be on the surface, right? Now, what of cortex that is found within white matter? So we call that as nuclei. Okay, now there are groups of nuclei found at the base of the brain. So collectively, we call them as basal nuclei, but in most books, they call them as basal ganglia, all right? Now, basal ganglia and basal nuclei is one and the same. Main function is motor coordination, right? So we plan movement, but executing of that movement has to be in a coordinated manner so that we don't fall, we don't kick ourselves out of balance, the right amount of tone in that movement, all that the basal ganglia is involved. Okay, and in the basal ganglia, we have, of course, inhibitory neurons and excitatory neurons. Okay, one of the major inhibitory neurotransmitters in the basal ganglia is actually dopamine. Okay, and that's why it is implicated in conditions such as Parkinson's disease and otherwise, where now we see that this individual loses muscle coordination, therefore tremors and other issues come into play, and eventually speech is lost along the way. So that's the point. Next is primary sensory areas, for example, vision and auditory areas. So we talked about Brodmann areas and where to find these areas. Like vision, we're talking about Brodmann area 17. Then here are 42 and 43 as primary auditory areas. So those areas are connected to the diencephalon, or rather the diencephalon is connected to these areas for proper coordination of these functions of the brain. So here is just, you know, to show where some of the parts of the diencephalon are located. That is the thalamus. Then this is the corpus callosum. Then this is the hypothalamus. Then optic chiasma, where the optic nerve crosses from one side to the other. That is a pituitary gland. That's a pituitary stalk. That's a mammillary body. And that is a pineal gland. All right. So subthalamus, epithalamus. So subthalamus, this one and that one, plus this. Hypothalamus, then thalamus. Now we're saying since the walls of the thalamus form the third ventricle, so this space here is the third ventricle. Sorry, I said fourth, third. That's the third ventricle. Then you can see a small opening there. That is known as the foramen of Monro. So that foramen is coming from the lateral ventricle, because cerebrospinal fluid should flow from the lateral ventricles into the third ventricles on both sides, left and right side. So that is foramen of Monro. Next is the midbrain. That's the midbrain. Pons, that is cerebellum, and that is medulla oblongata. So connecting, this is the fourth ventricle now. Fourth ventricle, third ventricle. To connect this space to this space, there is the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. So that tunnel there is cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius, right? Of course, you remember this part known as sella tussica, where the pituitary gland is located. So there are various disorders that affect the pituitary gland. Most commonly is, for example, insufficient production of growth hormone, or indeed overproduction of growth hormone, leading to conditions such as dwarfism and gigantism. That is a giant. This is a child who is failing to grow at the same rate as others. So we expect a certain height at a certain age, but this child is failing because maybe there is insufficient growth hormone. So yes, growth hormone disorder, dwarfism, right? Then this guy here, now you see that he's overgrown. So that's gigantism. Okay, now gigantism occurs when now there is oversecretion of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. And this occurs when that oversecretion begins from childhood. Now, sometimes conditions occur where oversecretion of growth hormone occurs when this person is already an adult, meaning the growth plate has closed. Okay, so what happens now is a condition known as acromegaly. Okay, so the bones can no longer grow in length because this person is already past their anatomical maturity. What follows next is as the density of the bones increases. So look at the size of the fingers there, look at the size of the chin, and changes in the face. Here she was a pretty woman with facial features in proportion, but now the bones of the face, the skull itself is overgrowing and leads to changes in their appearance. Now, of course, most of you might be aware of Mary Ann Bevan, a woman who won a contest known as the ugliest woman on earth. Now, there's a story around that where she was just trying to survive. Previously, she was okay, but because of overproduction of growth hormone led to her changes in facial features. Quite a traumatic experience, I might add, but she did all that to fend for her family. So people would go and just watch and pay to watch her. So she was part of the circus, you know, where this time you're going to see animals, for example, a lion, a tiger, but in the process also you find a human being there who is now being termed as the most ugly person on earth. So she was paid out of that, of course, just to survive, but that's unfortunate events like that. So that's about the diencephalon. I can quickly look at the brain stem, right? Or the seat of vital signs, labeled in green here. Midbrain, we can call it the mesencephalon. Pons plus cerebellum, which is cut off here, which is shown there, collectively are known as the metencephalon. Then the last part is the myelencephalon, or simply medulla oblongata. Now, during early development of the brain, we said the pons plus the medulla oblongata is known as the rhombencephalon. This is mesencephalon. Then cerebrum plus diencephalon was prosencephalon, or simply the forebrain. So forebrain, that one and this one. Midbrain, midbrain, hindbrain, these two structures here. So everything to do with unconscious or involuntary function of the human body is concerned with the brain stem. So that's the brain stem. Okay, shown here. So let's begin with the medulla oblongata. So sorry, this time we're starting from the bottom, then we can climb up a bit. All right, so what are we expecting as functions of the medulla oblongata? So first of all, it contains a lot of autonomic regulatory centers. For example, respiratory center, circulatory center, and gastrointestinal motility center. So in short, functionality of these parts are controlled by the medulla oblongata, meaning damage to the medulla oblongata where these nuclei or centers, remember, centers or nuclei is one and the same. It's just a collection of cell bodies, all right? Then they are commanding these other things to occur. So if there's damage, for example, to the respiratory center, then this person fails to maintain respiration under the normal physiology that we expect. So what follows next is that that person may actually die out of that. So that is this part we are looking at, medulla oblongata. We're looking at it from the back view. That is the front of view. Structures to be aware of when it comes to the medulla oblongata. Number one is these two anterior swellings. Look at that, look at that. Now, these swellings are consistent with the spinal cord. So you see that the size, of course, reduces as we go towards the spinal cord. And we call those as anterior columns of the spinal cord. But here, the name is changing. We call these as pyramids. So the brain has pyramids, all right? Now, just where the spinal cord and the medulla oblongata connects, we see the special structure there known as decussation of pyramids. Now, what happens at this point is that nerves, especially sensory nerves and motor nerves. So let's begin with sensory nerves. Sensory nerves originating from the spinal cord, but climbing up towards the brain stem. When they reach this part, they'll cross, most of them, we can say roughly 90% of sensory nerves will cross from the right side to the left and vice versa. Those that are traveling here will cross to the other side. So this is the area of decussation or crossing over or bridging, if you like. Same with motor nerves. Motor nerves coming from the brain cerebrum, from the diencephalon, from the midbrain pons, and so on. When they're traveling in this fashion, when they reach this point, those motor nerves that are originating from the right side of the brain will cross to the left side of the spinal cord. And that's how now we see that majority of motor nerves of the right brain will control the left part of the body. And again, majority of sensory nerves arising from the left side of the body will be interpreted by the right part of the brain because of this decussation that occurs there. It's the most important structure there, decussation, crossing over. These are pyramids, right? Next are olives. So lateral and posterior to the pyramids are somewhat, smaller swellings. We call those as olives. Medulla oblongata, olives. Pyramids, olives. All right. Then between the pyramid and the olive, we find that depression there. So we'll call that as a sulcus. All right. If this was cerebrum, we would have called this gyrus and this gyrus, but we don't do that because this is brain stem. So this is pyramid, that is olive. Then that is the sulcus. Okay. So that is the sulcus between the olive and the pyramid. Same structure is seen between the pons and the medulla oblongata. There's that swell depression there. Okay. So that is a sulcus as well, connecting the pons to the medulla oblongata. Now, you see that in these sulci, we are finding different and several cranial nerves. Look at that. So what we have there is hypoglossal nerve. Then we also have accessory nerve or cranial nerve number 12. Okay, and several other cranial nerves on like that. Right. So these are mentioned already. Now, even the pyramids, talked about them. Function of medulla oblongata. So it's a pathway or conduit for ascending and descending nerves. So descending nerves, these are motor. They are coming from the brain and going to the spinal cord. Ascending nerves are sensory. They're coming from the spinal cord going to the brain. Apart from that, it has various other, vital centers, centers for heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing. Aside from that, it serves as the origin for the last 4 cranial nerves. Cranial nerve number 9, 10, 11, and 12. Glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal nerve. All these nerves, their origin is a medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata. Let's look at the pons, or what we can say the metencephalon, this structure here. Metencephalon. So simply lies anterior to the cerebellum. So posterior to it is a cerebellum, like you can see here. That is cerebellum, pons. So collectively, this one and this one, we call them as metencephalon. Okay. Connects medulla oblongata to midbrain. So here, midbrain is not shown because it's cut off. But if you go back to that structure, you see that they are connected. Pons, midbrain, medulla oblongata. So it's acting as a connector. Midbrain, medulla oblongata. Okay. So what happens now in the pons? So it's quite smaller in size, but it also serves as origin of another set of cranial nerves. So cranial nerve number 5 up to cranial nerve number 8. Their origin or their cell bodies or nuclei, if you like, will be found in the pons, right? So that is trigeminal nerve, abducens nerve, facial nerve, and vestibular cochlear nerve. Their origin is from the pons. Even though some of them will lie here, like in the sulcus between the pons and the medulla oblongata, their cell bodies will be actually in the pons. So you see, the last 4 cranial nerves, medulla oblongata. Okay. Again, the other 4, medulla oblongata. Then the remainder will be brainstem and forebrain. Okay. We'll discuss that more when we start looking at the cranial nerves in particular. So what is the function of the pons? Again, it's just a pathway for ascending and descending, nerves. So motor nerves are descending. They are coming from the midbrain. They have to pass through the pons and connect to the medulla oblongata. Ascending nerves are sensory. They are coming from medulla oblongata and they have to pass through the pons to reach the midbrain. Therefore, it simply connects the cortex with the spinal cord. Or vice versa. It connects the spinal cord with the cortex because both sensory and motor are passing through, or simply ascending and descending. Or you can simply say afferent and efferent. You are still correct in that. There is no harm in saying it that way. Finally, we look at the midbrain, known as the mesencephalon. Now, mesencephalon, we're saying connects the pons with cerebellum. Connects pons, cerebellum with the forebrain, which we call the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. Collectively, we call that as diencephalon and telencephalon. So, the cerebellum is here, the pons is there. This part, pons plus cerebellum, we call it the metencephalon. So simply, the midbrain connects the metencephalon to the forebrain. And forebrain has two parts, diencephalon and cerebrum, right? Okay. So in terms of connection in the midbrain, we have cranial nerve number 4 and 3. So cranial nerve number 3 and 4 will arise from the midbrain. Okay, then cranial nerve number 1, cranial nerve number 2 are connected with the telencephalon, right? So that's all about the midbrain. What we can look at now is cranial nerves, right? So looking at time, I think we can have that discussion in another session. For now, we can end here. Like I always say, if there are any questions, you can still reach out to me. Then we can have this discussion.